Snow fell on the makeshift camp where Sarah Connor knelt beside her dying daughter, watching a Comanche medicine man prepare herbs that might save the child's life. Her hands trembled as Tonto Crowfeather approached, his weathered face unreadable. In the firelight, Ellie's breathing came shallow and quick. The fever had burned through her small body for days, leaving her skin pale as winter sky. Sarah's arms ached from carrying her daughter through the blizzard, but the weight of her choice pressed harder than any physical burden. Tonto knelt without speaking. His movements held the careful precision of someone who had done this many times before. The scent of sage and other herbs filled the crude shelter as he began his work. Sarah watched his hands. They were gentle as they touched Ellie's forehead, checking the fever's heat. These were the hands her people called savage. These were the hands that might hold her daughter's only chance. The wind howled outside, sealing them in this moment between worlds. Between the life Sarah had known and whatever would come after. Between the fear that had driven her here and the hope that kept her from fleeing. 3 days earlier, Millbrook Settlement had been dying by degrees. The fever had taken 6 children already. Martha Collins lost her twin boys within hours of each other. The Henderson baby never woke from the first night's burning. Sarah had listened to the women weep. She had helped dig the small graves. She had prayed with the others when Pastor Williams spoke of God's mysterious ways. But when Ellie's fever spiked that final morning, prayer felt like talking to empty sky. The settlement's doctor was a former barber named Stevens. He bled the sick children and gave them mercury treatments that seemed to make everything worse. His hands shook when he worked, and his eyes held the desperate look of a man drowning in his own failures. Dutch van der Linde had gathered the men in the meeting hall. His voice carried the authority of someone who owned half the territory's mining claims. The fever was no natural sickness, he declared. The Comanche had cursed the water. The Comanche had brought death to their children. The men nodded and fingered their rifle stocks. They spoke of riding out to find the nearest tribe. They spoke of making the red men pay for what they had done. Sarah said nothing. She held Ellie tighter and felt the heat radiating from her small body. The child's lips had begun to crack. Her eyes stayed closed even when Sarah whispered her name. That night, Arthur Morgan found Sarah sitting by Ellie's bedside. The old tracker moved quietly for such a large man. His face held lines carved by decades of frontier life, but his eyes still held kindness. Arthur spoke in whispers. There was a story he had heard from traders passing through. A ghost Comanche who lived alone in the high country. A man who had been cast out from his own people, but still knew the old ways of healing. Sarah listened without breathing. Arthur had seen things in his years of tracking. He knew the difference between legend and truth. When he spoke of the Comanche healer, his voice carried conviction. The decision came without conscious thought. Sarah wrapped Ellie in every blanket she owned and loaded their horse before dawn. She left no note. There was nothing to explain. That her neighbors would understand. The ride took her through country she had never seen. The storm caught them halfway to the high country, turning the world white and cold. Sarah pressed forward because stopping meant watching Ellie die in. The saddle. The horse found the trail when Sarah could no longer see it. Animals knew things people had forgotten. The path wound between rocks and stunted trees until it ended at a shelter built into the hillside. Smoke rose from a hidden chimney. Someone lived here in the place between civilization and wilderness. Someone who had chosen exile over the compromises required to belong. Sarah dismounted and carried Ellie to the shelter's entrance. Her daughter weighed nothing now, as if the fever had burned away everything but her spirit. Sarah called out once, then waited. Tonto emerged without surprise, as if he had been expecting them. His face showed no emotion as he studied the dying child. He spoke no English, but gesture needed no translation. He motioned them inside. The shelter was larger than it appeared from outside. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters. Clay pots held mysterious powders and dried roots. The air smelled of smoke and medicine and something else Sarah could not name. Tonto prepared a bed from buffalo robes and soft furs. He laid Ellie down with the same care Sarah had seen her husband use when handling newborn calves. His movements spoke of someone who understood fragile things. Sarah sat beside the bed and watched this man she had been taught to fear. His hair was streaked with gray. His hands bore scars from old wounds. But his touch on Ellie's forehead was as gentle as any mother's. The preparation of medicine became a ritual. Tonto selected herbs with deliberate precision. He ground them between stones worn smooth by countless uses. He heated water in a clay pot until steam rose like prayers. Sarah found herself leaning forward, trying to understand. Each plant seemed chosen for a specific purpose. Each mixture held knowledge passed down through generations. This was not the savage magic Dutch had described. This was science, older than any book. Tonto began to chant softly as he worked. The words were foreign, but the rhythm was familiar. Sarah had heard similar sounds when her own mother sang lullabies. The music of comfort was universal. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury. Snow piled against the shelter's walls. The wind carried voices that might have been spirits or might have been loneliness given sound. Inside, warmth and hope began to take root. Ellie's breathing grew steadier as the first of Tonto's medicines took effect. Her skin lost some of its terrible heat. Her lips no longer moved in silent distress. Sarah felt her own breathing slow. For the first time in days, the desperate flight through the storm had brought them here. To this place where healing was possible. To this man who asked nothing but gave everything. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty and promise. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and settled beside her daughter's bed. Whatever came next, they would face it together. All three of them, bound by need and hope and the simple fact that some things mattered more than fear. Dawn broke pale through the shelter's smoke hole. Ellie's fever had finally broken during the night, leaving her skin cool and her breathing steady. Sarah touched her daughter's forehead and felt the miracle of ordinary temperature. Tonto sat by the dying fire, grinding herbs between worn stones. His movements held the rhythm of morning ritual. Sarah watched his hands work and wondered how many children those fingers had saved. The storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in pristine snow. But the silence between the three of them felt different now, less desperate. More like the quiet of people who had shared something sacred. Sarah rose and walked to the shelter's entrance. The morning air bit at her lungs, sharp and clean. Behind her, Ellie stirred and spoke her first words in days. "Mama, I'm hungry." The sound of her daughter's voice hit Sarah with the force of answered prayer. She turned and found Ellie sitting up, eyes clear and focused. The child looked around the shelter with curiosity instead of the glazed confusion of fever. Tonto nodded once and continued his work. No triumph showed on his weathered face. This was simply what he did, what he had always done. Sarah helped Ellie sit up fully and offered her water from a clay cup. The child drank carefully, as if remembering how. Her movements were weak but purposeful. Life had returned to occupy her small body. While Ellie rested, Sarah explored the shelter more carefully. What she found in the shadowed corners changed everything she thought she knew about this place, and the man who lived here. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, each one carefully labeled with symbols Sarah could not read. But tucked between the medicine bundles were small leather pouches, and these bore names written in careful English script. Maria Gonzalez, Santa Fe. Samuel Washington, formerly enslaved. Emma Clark, Millbrook. Sarah's hands trembled as she found more pouches, dozens of them. Each one containing medicine prepared for a specific child in a specific place. Children from settlements scattered across the territory. Emma Clark. Sarah knew that name. Emma was the daughter of a family that had passed through Millbrook 2 months ago. The child had been sick then, burning with fever. The family had been heading west, hoping to find help. Sarah stared at the pouch bearing Emma's name. The leather was worn smooth, as if it had been handled many times. As if someone had prepared medicine for a dying child and then waited, hoping the family would find their way here. She turned to find Tonto watching her. His dark eyes held no shame, no defensiveness. Only the patient acceptance of someone who had long ago stopped expecting understanding from others. "You do this for all of them," Sarah said. Her voice came out as a whisper. "You save all of them." Tonto rose and walked to where she stood among the medicine bundles. He touched the pouch bearing Emma's name, then pointed toward the shelter's entrance. Toward the world beyond where sick children waited for healing. He spoke in Comanche, words Sarah could not understand but felt in her bones. The tone carried weight and sorrow and something that might have been hope. When he finished, he gestured to himself and then to the medicine bundles. This was his purpose. His exile had become his calling. Sarah found her voice again. "Why were you cast out?" Tonto studied her face for a long moment. Then he walked to the fire and picked up a stick, using it to draw symbols in the dirt floor. A horse, a rider, a settlement. Lines crossing between them. He drew figures of people and made slashing motions with the stick. Warriors attacking, raids, the kind of violence that had defined the frontier for generations. Then he threw the stick aside and shook his head. He pointed to himself and made a gesture Sarah interpreted as refusal. He had said no to the raids. No to the violence. No to the war that consumed both sides. The cost of that refusal was written in the lines of his face. To be cast out from your people was to die a kind of death. To live between worlds, belonging to neither. But he had found another way to live. Another way to serve. Sarah spent the morning watching him work. His knowledge of plants and healing ran deeper than anything she had imagined. Each remedy was precisely crafted for its intended patient. Each dose calculated with the care of someone who understood that a child's life hung in the balance. When Ellie grew strong enough to sit by the fire, Tonto prepared soup from roots and herbs. The broth was thin but nourishing, designed to ease a recovering stomach back into the habit of digestion. Sarah tasted the soup and found it better than anything she had eaten in weeks. The flavors were complex and earthy, speaking of knowledge passed down through generations of healers. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked. Tonto looked at her and then at Ellie. He pointed to the child and made a gesture that encompassed the shelter and all its medicines. Then he pointed to himself and touched his chest over his heart. Some knowledge came from teaching. Some came from the heart's recognition of what mattered. The afternoon brought the sound of horse hooves on packed snow. Sarah tensed, but Tonto showed no alarm. He rose and walked to the shelter's entrance, listening to the approaching rider with the attention of someone who had learned to read the intentions of visitors from the rhythm of their travel. Arthur Morgan appeared at the shelter's entrance, his weathered face creased with concern. Snow clung to his beard and the shoulders of his coat. His horse stood behind him, breathing hard from the climb. "Sarah," Arthur said, his voice carrying relief. "The whole settlement's been looking for you." Sarah stood and moved protectively toward Ellie. "She's alive, Arthur. She's going to be fine." Arthur's eyes found Tonto and held there. The two men studied each other with the careful attention of predators determining threat. But neither showed hostility, only the wariness of men who had learned to read danger in small signs. "Dutch is organizing a search party," Arthur said. "He's got the men worked up about Comanche raiders taking you and the child." Sarah felt the weight of that information settle into her bones. Dutch van der Linde saw everything in terms of territory and control. A woman fleeing to seek help from the enemy would be seen as betrayal or madness. "You need to come back," Arthur continued. "Before he does something we'll all regret." Sarah looked at Tonto, then at Ellie, then back at Arthur. The choice facing her was larger than just returning home. It was about what kind of world she wanted her daughter to inherit. "Arthur," she said, her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest, "what if Dutch is wrong about everything?" Arthur's expression shifted. His eyes found the medicine bundles hanging from the rafters. The careful organization of the healing supplies. The evidence of knowledge and compassion in every corner of the shelter. What if he's wrong about what? Arthur asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah gestured to the medicine bundles, to Tonto's careful work, to her daughter sitting healthy by the fire. What if the enemy isn't who we think it is? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Arthur removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. His weathered face showed the strain of a man confronting the possibility that everything he had believed might be built on lies. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of winter settling deeper into the mountains. Inside the shelter, 4 people sat in the kind of silence that precedes revelation. The kind of quiet that comes before the world changes forever. Arthur dismounted and approached the shelter with careful steps. His eyes moved from Sarah to Ellie to the medicine bundles hanging overhead. The weight of understanding settled into his weathered features. "There's something you need to know," Arthur said, his voice carrying the gravity of confession. "About Dutch, about what's really making the children sick." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Arthur's tone held the weight of secrets too heavy to carry alone. She glanced at Tonto, who continued grinding herbs with steady hands, but his attention had sharpened. "The water," Arthur continued, "it's not cursed, it's poisoned." The words hit Sarah with the force of revelation. She thought of Dutch's mining operations upstream from the settlement. The way he had pushed so hard for expansion. The way he had been so quick to blame the Comanche for the fever. Arthur pulled a glass vial from his coat pocket. The water inside was clear, but something about it seemed wrong. Too still. Too lifeless. "I took this from Dutch's mine runoff," Arthur said. "Had it tested by a real doctor in Santa Fe. Mercury, lead, things that kill children slow." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. The fury building in her chest was clean and cold. Dutch had known. He had watched children die and used their deaths to build his own power. "How long have you known?" she asked. 2 months, Arthur replied. "Maybe longer. I've been trying to gather proof that would stand up in court." Tonto rose and approached Arthur with measured steps. He gestured to the vial and then to himself. Arthur handed it over without hesitation. The Comanche medicine. Man held the glass up to the light, studying the contaminated water with the attention of someone who understood poison in all its forms. Tonto spoke in his own language, the words carrying the weight of diagnosis. Then he walked to his medicine bundles and selected several herbs. He crushed them between his fingers and let the powder fall into the vial. The water changed color. Instantly, turning a deep red that spoke of corruption revealed. Sarah stared at the transformation and felt the last of her illusions about Dutch crumble into dust. "He's been using the sickness," she said. "Using dead children to justify war," Arthur nodded. "He's got the territorial governor's ear. Promises of cleared land and mineral rights. All he needs is to unite the settlements against a common enemy." The sound of approaching horses cut through the mountain air. Multiple riders, moving fast up the narrow trail. Sarah felt her heart hammer against her ribs as she recognized the purposeful rhythm of men riding with violent intent. Arthur stepped to the shelter's entrance and peered down the slope. His face went pale beneath his beard. "Dutch, he's got 8 men with him. They're not coming to talk." Sarah gathered Ellie close, feeling her daughter's small body tremble against her chest. The child had been through too much already. The fever had barely broken, and now this. Tonto moved with sudden decisiveness. He pulled bundles of herbs from the rafters, and began stuffing them into leather pouches. His movements spoke of a man who had prepared for this moment, who had always known it would come. "There's a back trail," Arthur said. "Leads down to Marston's place. John's been helping me gather evidence about Dutch's operation." Sarah looked at Tonto, who continued his preparations with calm efficiency. "What about him?" "I stay," Tonto said in careful English. The words were his first in her language, and they carried the weight of final decision. The approaching horses grew louder. Sarah could hear Dutch's voice now, calling out orders to his men. The tone was wrong for a rescue mission. Too harsh. Too eager. Arthur pressed a leather satchel into Sarah's hands. "Evidence," he said. "Everything we've gathered. Get it to John. He knows people who can make this public." Sarah felt the weight of the satchel and understood she was holding Dutch's downfall. But the cost of carrying it might be measured in blood. "Come with us," she said to Tonto. "You don't have to face this alone." The Comanche medicine man shook his head. He gestured to the shelter and all its medicines, to the life's work that represented his answer to exile and loss. This was his place, his purpose. The horses were close now. Sarah could hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Dutch's voice carried through the thin air, painting pictures of Comanche violence and righteous vengeance. Arthur moved to the shelter's rear entrance, a narrow opening that led to the back trail. Sarah followed with Ellie in her arms, but she paused at the threshold to look back at Tonto. The medicine man stood among his herbs and healing bundles, a figure of quiet dignity, facing the storm that was about to break over his sanctuary. His dark eyes met Sarah's, and she saw in them the same resignation she had witnessed in her husband's face before he left for war. Some battles chose you. Some stands had to be made alone. Dutch's voice rang out from the front of the shelter, commanding surrender. His words painted Sarah as a madwoman, driven insane by grief and Comanche witchcraft. Ellie as a victim who needed rescue from savage hands. The narrative was already written. The truth would be buried with anyone who tried to tell it. Sarah stepped through the rear entrance and into the cold mountain air. Arthur led the way down a treacherous trail that wound between snow-covered rocks. Behind them, the sound of confrontation began. Dutch's voice, smooth and reasonable, explaining the situation to Tonto in terms of territorial law and civilized justice. The scrape of boots on stone as his men positioned themselves around the shelter. Sarah clutched Ellie closer and focused on the trail ahead. Each step carried them further from the man who had saved her daughter's life. Each step felt like abandonment. But the satchel in her hands held power. The evidence that could expose Dutch's crimes and honor Tonto's sacrifice. The truth that might prevent other children from dying for one man's ambition. The trail descended through stands of pine and aspen, their branches heavy with snow. Sarah's breath came in sharp puffs as she struggled to keep pace with Arthur's longer strides. Ellie had grown quiet, sensing the danger that pursued them. Behind them, the sound of voices grew fainter but more urgent. Dutch's reasonable tone had given way to something harder, more demanding. The sound of a man who had come too far to accept defeat. Arthur led them to a hidden overhang where 3 horses waited, their breath steaming in the cold air. John Marston emerged from the shadows, his face grim with understanding. "How bad?" John asked. "Bad enough," Arthur replied. "Dutch knows we've been gathering evidence. He's not planning to leave witnesses." John helped Sarah mount one of the horses, settling Ellie in front of her. His movements were efficient and gentle, speaking of a man who understood the value of innocent life. "Where do we go?" Sarah asked. "Santa Fe," John said. "Federal marshal there owes me a favor. He'll listen to what we have to say." The 3 horses moved down the mountain trail with careful urgency. Behind them, the sound of confrontation faded into the vast silence of the high country. Sarah did not look back. She could not bear to see smoke rising from the place where a good man had made his final stand. The trail wound through country that grew gradually warmer as they descended. The snow gave way to exposed rock and hardy grass. The horses found their rhythm, carrying their riders toward a reckoning that would determine the future of the entire territory. Sarah felt the weight of the evidence in her hands and the warmth of her daughter's body against her chest. Tonto's sacrifice had given them this chance. The least she could do was make it count. The federal marshal's office in Santa Fe buzzed with controlled chaos when Sarah arrived with Arthur and John. Marshal William Kane studied the evidence spread across his desk with the methodical attention of a man who had learned to separate truth from frontier legend. The water samples told their story in chemical certainty. The witness statements formed a pattern of deliberate deception. Dutch van der Linde's carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of documented proof. "This is enough, too." "Hang him," Kane said, his weathered fingers tracing the edges of the testimony. "But we need to move fast. Men with Dutch's connections don't stay arrested long." Sarah held Ellie closer and felt the child's steady breathing against her chest. The fever was gone, but the memory of those terrible days remained. The knowledge that Dutch had orchestrated it all burned in her chest with quiet fury. Kane organized a posse of federal agents and territorial rangers. The ride back to Millbrook took 2 days through country that seemed to hold its breath. The landscape reflected the tension building toward confrontation. Clear skies and sharp wind that cut through winter coats and pretense alike. They found Millbrook in the grip of manufactured hysteria. Dutch had returned from the mountains with stories of Comanche atrocities and a woman driven mad by grief. The settlement's men cleaned their rifles and spoke of righteous vengeance. Sarah watched from the ridge overlooking the town as Kane's men positioned themselves around the meeting hall. Dutch stood at the center of the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a man who had learned to turn fear into power. The moment of confrontation came with the quiet authority of federal law. Kane walked into the meeting hall without ceremony, his badge catching the lamplight. The room fell silent as the weight of outside authority settled over the proceedings. "Dutch van der Linde," Kane said, his voice carrying across the hushed space. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and negligent homicide." Dutch's face went through a series of calculations. Surprise, anger, the desperate search for an escape that did not exist. His carefully constructed kingdom crumbled as Kane read the charges and the evidence that supported them. The settlers listened in stunned silence as the truth unfolded. The contaminated water, the staged raids, the children who had died to support Dutch's ambition. The room's atmosphere shifted from righteous anger to sick understanding. Sarah entered the hall, carrying Ellie, who had insisted on being present for this moment. The child's clear eyes and healthy color stood as testament to the healing that had sparked everything. The proof that enemies could become saviors when fear gave way to trust. "This is the woman you called mad," Kane announced. "She saved her daughter's life by seeking help from the man you were ready to hunt down." The settlers stared at Sarah and Ellie with the confusion of people whose entire worldview had been revealed as fabrication. Some faces showed anger at being deceived. Others reflected the deeper shame of recognizing their own willingness to embrace hatred. Dutch made one final attempt to control the narrative. He spoke of territorial security and the greater good, of sacrifices necessary for civilization's advance. His words fell flat in the face of documented evidence and a child's innocent presence. The arrest proceeded with quiet efficiency. Dutch's men melted away as their leader was led to the waiting wagon. Power built on lies collapsed quickly once the foundation cracked. But the real transformation came in the days that followed. Sarah found herself at the center of conversations that would have been impossible a week earlier. Settlers speaking of cooperation instead of conflict. Traders mentioning Comanche healers with respect instead of fear. Arthur returned from the mountains with news that changed everything. Tonto had survived Dutch's confrontation. The medicine man had vanished into the high country before Dutch's men could act, taking his knowledge and his bundles of healing herbs to a new sanctuary. The network of healing that Tonto had built began to emerge from the shadows. Families from across the territory came forward with stories of sick children saved by the mysterious Comanche doctor. The evidence of his work spread far beyond what anyone had imagined. Sarah wrote letters to territorial newspapers telling the story of her daughter's healing and the man who had made it possible. The response surprised her with its scope and intensity. Readers across the West, hungry for stories of hope instead of endless conflict. 6 months later, the healing center took shape in the valley between Millbrook and the foothills. Tonto emerged from hiding to work alongside doctors and nurses from multiple settlements. The building rose from shared labor and shared purpose. Children played in the center's yard without regard for the color of their skin or the language there. Parents spoke. Sarah watched them and saw the future taking root in soil that had been watered with too much blood for too long. Ellie grew strong and curious, helping Tonto tend the herb gardens that supplied the center's medicines. She learned plant names in 3 languages and the healing properties of roots and leaves. Her recovery had become the seed of something larger. The story spread beyond the territory's borders. Newspapers in distant cities picked up the tale of the desperate mother and the Comanche healer. The narrative that had stunned the West became a symbol of what was possible when fear gave way to trust. Sarah found herself writing more letters, responding to questions from people who wanted to understand how enemies had become allies, how healing had replaced hatred, how one child's fever had changed the course of history. The truth was simpler than the legend that grew around it. People were people. Children were children. Sickness was sickness. The labels that divided communities mattered less than the shared experience of love and loss and the desperate hope for something better. Tonto continued his work with the same quiet dedication that had marked his years of exile. He asked for nothing but gave everything. His example inspired others to look beyond the boundaries that had seemed so permanent. The healing center became a beacon for the territory and beyond, proof that cooperation could triumph over conflict, that understanding could grow from the soil of tragedy, that the future belonged to those brave enough to choose trust over fear. Sarah often stood in the herb garden at sunset, watching Ellie help Tonto tend the plants that would become tomorrow's medicines. The child's laughter carried across the valley, a sound that had almost been lost to Dutch's poisoned water and poisoned dreams. The story that had stunned the West was still being written. Each healed child added another chapter. Each moment of cooperation between former enemies wrote another page. The narrative of hope growing stronger than the old stories of endless war. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.